This is a long-standing project and something I committed to before the election, and therefore it's delivering on that promise, and it's consistent with what we did in the spring statement just the other day, which is in a period where the world seems more uncertain and more unstable. It's really important that we have economic stability in this country. This is really important. It's a big boost, £415 million on top of the other investment, which will mean better trains, Transpennine in particular, for the region. This is a huge region, many millions of people, huge ambition, brilliant businesses, and the transport system needs to match the ambition of the communities, and that's what we're doing today.
I want to talk to you about the spring statement. We haven't really had a chance to talk to you since then, since the impact assessment showed that...
The debate on the introduction of a wealth tax in the UK has become one of the central topics in the political and economic discourse. This issue has been raised more than once recently, and although support for this idea among certain political circles is quite high, nevertheless, behind its implementation there is not only theoretical appeal, but also serious practical and political challenges. Thus, the idea of introducing a wealth tax became topical after a group of MPs proposed to impose a tax on people whose wealth exceeds £10 million. They believe that the introduction of such a tax could be a solution to replace some of the social spending that is being cut in the country's budget and allow to reduce the burden on the less well-off strata of the population. The question of whether the UK should introduce a wealth tax is of concern to many. The proposal in Parliament is not only of interest to politicians but also to the general public, as it is about how to redistribute wealth in the country and create a taxation system that is fairer for all. Under the proposal, a 1% tax would have been imposed on assets that exceed £10 million. It also considered the possibility that such taxes could partially cover cuts to social services, including social care and health. This has attracted huge interest because if such a measure were to be implemented, it could make a significant difference to the country's financial position. However, before discussing how the introduction of a wealth tax could affect the economy, it is necessary to understand why this issue is still unresolved and why, despite loud calls, a wealth tax has never been introduced in the UK. One of the strongest arguments from opponents is the view that a wealth tax is not an effective way of redistributing funds and indeed could have a negative impact on the economy. This view is supported by a number of economists who argue that such a measure will not lead to significant revenues for the budget, but instead will provoke capital flight and the flight of rich people to other countries with more favorable tax policies. For example, the experience of other countries, including Spain, has shown that the introduction of a wealth tax does not produce the results that were expected. In Spain, despite the introduction of a wealth tax, its effectiveness was low, as wealthy people with assets exceeding several million euros began to hide their assets or move them to other jurisdictions with more liberal tax laws. As a result, the state was only able to collect small amounts that did not meet expectations. A similar situation was observed in other countries such as France and Sweden, where the wealth tax also failed to provide the desired effect. It is worth noting that, in theory, the wealth tax system should have worked, because the richest people in the country end up having such significant assets that they can afford to pay such taxes. But as practice has shown, these people very quickly find ways to avoid paying the tax by moving their assets to more favorable jurisdictions or hiding them in various forms such as offshore. In addition, there is a view that the introduction of a wealth tax may create additional risks for the British economy, which is already facing a number of problems in the context of globalization. And many of Britain's wealthy own large assets, invest in British companies and create jobs. If taxes on wealth become too high, these people may start looking to other countries where taxation is more favorable, leading to less foreign investment in the UK and possibly even a capital flight. This risk is a concern for economists, as capital flight could lead to a decline in economic activity and increased unemployment in sectors that are directly dependent on wealthy people's investments. This is especially true in areas such as real estate and high-tech startups, in which British entrepreneurs and investors are heavily invested. Let us also consider another possible consequence of the introduction of a wealth tax: its political impact. The introduction of such a tax requires major legislative changes, as well as significant effort to control and implement the tax. After all, in order for the tax to be fair, the assets of all rich people must be accurately assessed, which is a difficult task in itself. Many of the wealthy already have teams of professionals at their disposal to help them evade taxes, hide their assets, or transfer them to other countries. For the authorities, this can be a real headache, because it will be extremely difficult to assess all assets and conduct an accurate assessment of the market value of real estate, shares, businesses, and other forms of property. In such conditions, the taxation system may become too cumbersome and non-transparent, which will cause dissatisfaction among taxpayers and create additional difficulties for the government authorities. The implementation of a wealth tax in the UK would inevitably cause a political storm. This topic is very sensitive for those among the wealthiest people, and they would immediately start objecting to such taxes, creating economic and political pressure. At the same time, even among those who support the idea of a wealth tax, there are concerns that such measures could lead to serious economic consequences, including business and capital migration, which could ultimately impact the British economy as a whole. As a result, while the wealth tax proposal has some merit, its implementation will require careful thought on all aspects, from legal to economic. A wealth tax is not a simple solution that can be introduced on the basis of a desire for fairness or social equality. It must be carefully crafted, and its implications for the economy and the political situation in the country must be studied. And while the UK continues to look for ways to address inequality and social justice, the wealth tax remains a controversial topic that requires further discussion and a measured approach. If one imagines the implementation of a wealth tax in the UK, the question arises, how effective can this tax realistically be? Despite the difficulties that other countries have faced and the multiple arguments from opponents of such a measure, there is a view that a wealth tax could be feasible in the UK. It is important to realize that this idea is not as utopian as it may seem at first glance, because it is aimed at a very narrow group of people, those who own assets worth more than £10 million. These individuals make up a small proportion of the country's population, only a few tens of thousands of people, which makes their detailed control and assessment of assets possible. It is worth noting that the valuation of wealthy individuals has long been used in other areas, such as divorce proceedings, where both parties are required to provide full details of their assets. This provides some basis for implementing a wealth tax, especially when it comes to those with this level of financial resources. The idea is to impose a 1% tax on these assets. This may seem like a relatively small tax, but for wealthy individuals with wealth at the £10 million level, it could be a significant amount. For example, for the owner of £10 million worth of assets, the tax would be £100,000 a year. For those at the upper end of this spectrum, the amount of tax could be in the millions. Unlike many other types of taxation, this would be a tax calculated on reasonable and accurate market valuations of assets, minimizing abuse and tax avoidance. It is also worth emphasizing that while these wealthy individuals are able to move their assets to other jurisdictions because they have the means and capacity to do so, the 1% tax amount may not be a sufficient reason for them to relocate en masse. That said, given that most of these people do not have easy money and their assets are often tied up in long-term investments in UK companies and real estate, the tax may be serious enough to make them consider whether to leave the country. However, there is another side of the coin. Opponents of the wealth tax argue that its introduction could cause serious political and economic repercussions. First of all, many argue that such a tax would lead to a massive outflow of capital, and with it, an outflow of wealthy people themselves who would seek more favorable tax jurisdictions. This would create a crisis of confidence and lead to a drop in the country's finances. The argument that wealthy people may leave the UK, especially in light of tax increases, is not so far from reality, as in recent years there has been a clear trend for wealthy people to migrate to countries with more favorable tax conditions, such as the United Arab Emirates, Switzerland, or even Italy. The fear of the so-called millionaires' exodus is constantly used in political debates as the main argument against tax increases for wealthy citizens. In addition, the asset valuation procedure can become incredibly complex and time-consuming. The very process of calculating the market value of all assets, from real estate to more complex forms of wealth such as stocks or shares in companies, requires a high level of professionalism and can be prone to error. Valuing such assets will require the involvement of whole teams of specialists, lawyers and valuers, which will inevitably create additional costs for the government. It is also complicated by the fact that wealthy individuals tend to hold many different assets in different countries, which complicates valuation and can lead to legal conflicts. Even if the tax system is sufficiently transparent and efficient, there is always the risk that the rich will find ways to avoid taxes through the use of various evasion schemes. An equally important issue is the political context. The introduction of a wealth tax could provoke strong protests from those who stand to lose if it is implemented, as well as from politicians interested in maintaining the status quo. This is particularly true for those who believe that rich people already contribute sufficiently to the economy through taxes on income, capital, and property. This raises the concern that the introduction of an additional tax could over-politicize the issue and cause significant upheaval in society. It would also make it more difficult to advance other needed reforms, such as improving the tax system for the middle class or tax changes for large corporations, which may be a more effective way to raise tax revenue in the long run. Instead of focusing solely on the wealthy, some economists suggest focusing on more simple and less controversial reforms. One such suggestion is to rework the taxation system for local taxes, such as property and land taxes, which in the UK can be fairer and less conflictual. It would also involve redistributing tax burdens so that the rich could not avoid paying taxes by simply moving their assets to other jurisdictions. Ultimately, while a wealth tax may be one solution to inequality, its implementation would require long-term political will and the government's ability to deal with the possible economic and social consequences. Thus, the idea of introducing a wealth tax in the UK remains quite controversial and multifaceted. On the one hand, it has a theoretical basis and can be implemented taking into account the peculiarities of the British society. But on the other hand, it faces many political and economic obstacles that can significantly limit its effectiveness. In any case, the decision to introduce a wealth tax will require careful thought and in-depth consultation among all stakeholders, from politicians to citizens. The introduction of a wealth tax in the UK has sparked heated debates about whether it is a viable solution to tackle inequality or would pose too many risks and political consequences. However, despite the current proposals and even the support of some MPs, it is worth recognizing that there are more pragmatic alternatives to introducing a wealth tax. Rather than focusing solely on the super-rich, other tax reforms should be considered that may be just as effective, but less difficult to implement and with fewer political consequences. One such proposal is to reform local taxes such as property and land taxes, which in the UK have long been in need of modernization. Let's start with the problem of property taxes. In the current UK system, the property tax, the so-called council tax, significantly fails to reflect the real value of property, especially for the wealthiest people. The tax was introduced in 1991 and has not been revised since. It is based on property values that were determined back then and does not take into account modern changes in the real estate market. The system is grossly unfair, especially for wealthy people living in expensive areas of the country, such as London, where property values have risen significantly over the past few decades. While middle and lower incomes face a strain on their financial situation, owners of expensive homes pay proportionately less, creating serious inequality. Note that these large wealthy families often pay far less in property taxes than they should given the real value of their property. For example, in areas with high property prices such as South London or the Kensington area, the estate tax may be only a few £100s, despite the fact that the value of the property may exceed several £1,000,000. This is causing resentment among those who do not have such assets but have to pay taxes in line with the higher rates. Estate tax reform is not only a matter of fairness but also an important step in tackling inequality in the country. The problem with property taxes is that the system is based on obsolete principles. It would be necessary to revise it by establishing more relevant criteria for property valuation. This should be done by local authorities who are primarily interested in the fair distribution of the tax burden. Updating the taxation system, bringing it in line with the real value of housing, would be much less painful than introducing a new wealth tax. However, such a reform would require considerable effort at all levels, from local authorities to Parliament. In addition, it would require major public consultation and legislative change, which is also politically difficult. Another alternative to introducing a wealth tax is to increase the capital gains tax. This tax is levied on gains from the sale of assets such as property, shares and other investments. In the UK, capital gains tax is relatively low, especially compared to income taxes at only 10 to 20%. For some large investors, especially those who hold assets for the long term, these rates are too low. This creates incentives for those who can afford to hold assets and hide their gains using minimal tax rates. An increase in capital gains tax would help create a fairer tax system while raising revenue without imposing new taxes. This would be an important step in achieving a fairer distribution of the tax burden among all segments of society. It is also worth considering the abolition of national insurance tax, which is compulsory for all employees and employers in the UK. This tax serves to fund the social system and government programs such as health services and pensions. However, abolishing it or replacing it with a fairer taxation system could be an effective solution. If the national tax were to be abolished, it could be replaced by an increase in income tax, which would provide the necessary funding on the one hand and reduce the burden on the low and middle classes on the other. At the same time, it would also affect the tax burden on richer people, since the income tax increase would be progressive. But no matter how these proposals look, they still face political hurdles. Reforming local taxes and increasing capital gains taxes are decisions that require not only alignment with different political forces, but also a long-term alignment of interests on all sides. Tax reform is always a sensitive topic in the UK, and any attempt to raise taxes is highly controversial. This is especially true for those representing the interests of big businessmen and wealthy citizens who will actively resist such measures. Yet despite the political barriers, many experts believe that these very measures, reforms to local taxes and capital gains tax, may be a more sustainable solution to tackle inequality than the introduction of a wealth tax. It is also important to realize that wealth taxes, while attractive as a theoretical solution, may be too risky and ineffective in the long run. If too stringent measures are introduced, there is a risk that wealthy people will look for ways to avoid taxes, leading to capital flight and creating an unfavorable economic situation. Therefore, it is always necessary to balance the need for fairness with the real consequences for the economy. In conclusion, while the idea of a wealth tax has its merits, there are more practical and less destructive alternatives, such as reforming local taxes and increasing capital gains tax. These measures would, on the one hand, improve the tax system, and on the other hand, would not generate as much political and economic resistance as a wealth tax.